All right, so in this one, I want to try to lay out kind of a multi-layered map or metaphor for how I see essentially suffering arising originally from source and then manifesting in our spirits, our souls, and our bodies in a number of ways, manifesting even in our environment. And I'm going to try to map what I see as the interplay and the interconnectedness between that. And my hope is, first, that it will give you kind of a different way of looking at this. And then secondly, maybe even provide some insights or some resources on how to begin doing healing work in a more effective way. And so essentially what I'm going to do here is I have an arrow that's moving outward. And what we're doing here is we're going from origin to manifestation, right? So in my model of things, right, the origin is oneness, the state of pure unrealized potential from which all springs and which all is, right? Ultimately out into environment, which is what this whiteboard is, what this arrow is, what this pen is, with whatever screen you're watching this on is, right? We'll call that E. And so what I'm going to try to do is to trace suffering from the origin in oneness out into the environment, and then show, especially as we get closer to the environment, the different ways I see it kind of mapping onto the human body and what that can tell us about it. And I made a video called Special Relativity, which lays out basically the map of how I think we go from oneness to a physical manifestation. So if you're really interested in this, you may want to watch that, because that's kind of more the deep dive here. I'm going to be kind of cribbing from that video for some shorthand concepts. I'll try to make them as clear as I can briefly here, but you may want to watch that for a little more backdrop. So essentially the metaphor I used is that oneness is the state of pure unrealized potential. It has no time, it has no space, it has no physicality, it has no features really. You could think of it kind of like the Buddhist concept of emptiness. It's something the human brain cannot conceive of, because the human brain by design thinks of things spatially, thinks of things temporally, or at least thinks of things having some kind of shape or design, some kind of dynamic. And so the concept of something simultaneously being nothing and being everything is just, I think, beyond the mind's ability to process. And so I think the closest we can get to it is to try to use metaphors to try to understand it. And in a nutshell, the metaphor I have for this, the best one I've been able to kind of come up with, the best one that's come to me, is water, right? So pure distilled water won't boil at the normal boiling point. Pure distilled water vapor, right, in the atmosphere will not form clouds. In both situations, they need some kind of disturbance or impurity to go through the transition, right? And so if you introduce some minerals, or you just like throw a stone into the distilled water, if it wasn't boiling before, right, even though it was at that boiling temperature, now it will, because its surface tension has been properly disturbed in a way for the bubbles to form. Likewise, in the atmosphere, clouds, there was this old practice of cloud seeding where people would shoot different particles and things into the sky. And the notion behind that, and the scientific truth, is that the cloud, in order to form, the water vapor needs some kind of dust particle or aerosol particle, something the water can essentially glob onto, some kind of locus of focus, where it can then begin building the structure around it. If it's just water with water with water, there's nothing for it to hold on to, so it can't form the cloud. And that's what I think oneness is essentially, right? At least in metaphor, it's kind of like that pure distilled pot of boiling water, which, even though it's at a high heat, isn't boiling. It's kind of like that water vapor in the sky, which, even though there's a ton of vapor, plenty for a cloud to form, it doesn't have those impurities or those other things in there to allow it to form. And so my theory, right, or really more my metaphor, is that the way oneness manifests into physicality is it begins by essentially introducing some kind of impurity or hardness, right, some kind of particle into itself. And the way I conceive of that is it essentially creates this concept of elseness, right? Because in oneness, again, everything is in pure potential, and my theory behind that is that everything is fully harmonized, everything fully balances itself out. So if there's positive or negative, right, It's all perfectly balanced such that there is no positive and there is no negative. There's just this invisible and spaceless dance between them with the potential for positive and negative to arise if the balance is ever thrown off. Then you can get positive, right? Or then you can get negative. But as long as they're perfectly harmonized in oneness, they exist only in the state of pure potential. And so really you'd only describe them by the potential for them to arise, not by their actual arising. And so the idea here is that to generate a physical universe, a physical experience of time and space, oneness essentially concentrates, right, or conceives of this notion of elseness. And elseness by itself is an impossibility. It's like a logical contradiction. It's almost kind of like introducing a bug or a logic bomb into a program or into a computer, because you're essentially asking or introducing into oneness something that cannot really exist on its own in isolation. Because again, in oneness, everything is, it's not even mixed, it's literally just singular. It's one, it's whole. And so when you have elseness, this concept of something being other than, right, something being apart from, right, something being distinct from, it's almost like that concept itself is kind of like that mineral that's thrown into the water, or that dust that's sprayed up into the sky that allows the water to boil, that allows the cloud to form. And so the way I picture elseness is kind of this twisted knot. I use the metaphor of like headphones, wired headphones, like for your phone that's been in your pocket too long and now it's this rat's nest, right? How does that always happen? That's kind of what elseness is, because I think the way elseness is achieved, right, if we kind of magnify it, this is all one, right? It's all oneness. But if you're here, right, and I'm here, and I assume, right, this perspective and you assume this perspective, we can kind of look across this divide and go, oh, you're here and I'm there, right? I'm this, you're that, even though really we are this, right? And so elseness is essentially kind of this tangle, this confusion that oneness introduces into itself to kind of disturb its pure harmony, to essentially birth a physical universe, right? That's the notion. Another idea I'll just briefly mention, because I know a lot of this is kind of abstract, would be like an octopus with tentacles, right? So one octopus, right? 8 tentacles. And let's say here and here, right? We have X and Y, you and me and you. I'm looking this way, you're looking this way, and it's like, oh, like I'm here and you're there. Like, this is me, that's you. Well, really we're 2 tentacles of the same octopus. And so you can kind of see that, right? I won't draw them, but these are kind of like the tentacles coming down here from the common head of the octopus. And the confusion is identifying exclusively with this perspective without appreciating the larger context from which these perspectives arise. And so elseness is essentially kind of a twisting or a curling within oneness, this tangling or folding that creates all these different counterpoints from which a single thing can, through a mistaken sense of identity, believe is experiencing elseness or something else. Okay. So then the idea, right, is that you have God and anti-God, right? God and evil, good and evil. God is, from oneness, the potential for unconditionally loving awareness, fully realized, right? Everything in oneness, again, has its counterpart, has its balance, right? Has its harmony. So if God is love, right? Unconditionally loving awareness in the positive. This is evil, unconditionally unloving awareness in the negative. In the state of oneness, they're harmonized, right? And so they don't exist in material form. They exist only as the potential to be. But when this oneness is again dropped in the boiling water, or dropped in the water to make it boil, sprayed into the sky to make it cloud, when that happens, God is able to assume God's form, and evil is able to assume evil's form in the world. And my notion is that essentially these exist in equal parts in the entirety of what is, and that evil's function is to essentially guard elseness, right? The illusion of elseness, to sustain it and to maintain it, maintain this sense of separateness, right? You, X, are here, you, Y, are here. You are not the one, right? You are not one thing together. So it's essentially trying to maintain the illusion, which we can think of as bad, but if we think the existence of the physical universe is good, which apparently oneness did, then we can realize that evil, right, or anti-God, is actually a necessary feature here. Because what God does, right, unconditionally loving awareness, is the truth, right, is broader contextualization, is whole understanding. And so if God is exposed to elseness, or really elseness is exposed to God, right, immediately all of these perspectives wake up, realize they're a single piece, right, and then there's a surrender back into the state of oneness, and nothing exists anymore, right? Now in that video I talked about how that I think is actually the end of the physical universe. What happens is that essentially God comes to realize that the entirety of the universe, including evil, is God and is one, right? And that can be reversed, right? That evil then looks and realizes that it too is God and it too is one. And that it's essentially that kind of triple dance, that kind of melding together that leads to the reestablishment of oneness, and then that the universe just rebirths itself again and again and again out of oneness, reusing the information gathered from each iteration to make the next experience richer, more loving, fuller, more dynamic. Okay, so move from oneness, right, with elseness to generate God and anti-God. Then we get into spirit. Spirit is the individuation of the God self. So I've drawn a single eye, but really there's a ton of eyes. In a given universe, perhaps we might say, using a metaphor, which is going to be a little messy, but let's go with it. Oneness as universe, right? God and anti-God are like a galaxy, and the spirits are like the stars in the galaxy, right? There may be that many. And each of them is an individual aspect of God, right? Maybe think of it kind of like the tentacles if we want to. We could think of it as apertures in the God self, different lenses or perspectives through which God can look out at and experience and express the entirety of what God is. But each of them, because they're in a unique position, right, in the whole, right, they're each able to look out and see differently, right? Even though they're all on the same string, all on the same one, because they each have a different and unique position and a unique perspective, their expression is different and their intake is different. And this is essentially how God has a richness of God's self-experience, is by individuating into all these different individual perspectives, which again are not separate, they're all one piece, but what is distinct about them is that they're identified with, right, associated with a particular position. And my concept here is that what God is essentially trying to do in the physical universe is to realize the truth of elseness, which is that elseness is also God, right? And elseness is one. And God does this by essentially shining the light of God's unconditionally loving awareness on the elseness, right? And because that loving awareness is able to see the whole instead of just from the individual parts, it can fully reunify things. So what I think is happening here at the level of individuation, right? Here, you've got here, you've got here, right? These are all different eyes. Pun intended, I guess. Is essentially God is slowly starting to try to realize the truth, right? Bit by bit. And again, if there was no anti-God, it would be instantaneous. The universe would be born and would die in an instant, because God, having full awareness, would go, oh, I'm not actually these little pieces, and I'm not actually in this tangle a bunch of different folds, right? This is all a single thing, right? A single expression, and it would all be reharmonized back in. So it's evil that is performing the function of essentially blocking, right? Confusing these individual parts, making them think they really are individuals, making them really think I'm my own standalone thing, right? I'm my island. I'm my little private part, my little private pocket of the universe. And this is how spirit essentially forgets or loses its realization that it is God, that it never stops being God. And the reason is it identifies with this perspective, and evil, right, uses deception, tricks, confusion to keep the God self, right, the spirit, from realizing that larger truth, right? So it keeps it caught up in its own private concerns, its own private troubles, its little rivalries, right, against this guy, back against this guy. So that's how things are working from the God level to the spirit level. Now an individual spirit, right, let's take this one and bring it down. If we picture it kind of like the hubcap in the middle of a wheel, an individual spirit will manifest a series of physical lives, right? And essentially is doing the same thing that God did, right? Just as God individuated in a number of spirits to give God a number of different perspectives on God's self, to give God a rich and diverse array of experiences so that God can more fully understand and appreciate the universe. The Spirit then emulates God in that way and does the same thing. It individuates into a series of physical lives. And the reason I array it this way as opposed to say on a line is you may think, okay, over time, when we hear about like past lives, maybe think, okay, the spirit jumped in here, there's a death, the spirit goes up, then the spirit goes down, death, spirit comes up. And I think there is a truth to that experience in terms of time, but I think a way to map it that reflects more the nature of the experience of the spirit is that the spirit really isn't in the flow of time. The spirit, though, is in the flow of experience, and the spirit is simultaneously experiencing all these separate lives. And, I would have never paused there to let a garbage truck go by. What I was going to say is, I would never want to try to reduce what is the meaning of life or the purpose to life. I think the purpose of life is the full, uncharacterized, uninterpreted experience of life in all its richness, every pixel, every moment of it. There's no waste, there's no slack, no matter how it seems from this perspective. So the purpose of the meaning of life is the full experience of life. I think if we were, though, to try to say what is one of the meanings or the purposes of life like we could metaphorize to it or analogize to it, it would be something like trying to get a greater appreciation of what this elseness is all about. And so the spirit can sense there's something in here, that there's something going on, right? That there's something the spirit can't quite capture or understand. It gets that it's confused, but it doesn't really get what the confusion is blocking it from. Just as God then individuated into spirits to try to get a better sense on that, the spirit then individuates into beings, all of it trying to be, give me another lens on things, give me a different perspective on it, let me look at it in a different way. And an image here I use, I don't got the skills to draw a jewel very well, but picture a big jewel here, and it's got all the different facets on it, right? And we could think of elseness as maybe being kind of curled in the middle of the jewel. And the spirit or God is like a seer that's trying to look in and discover this pattern, right? And again, evil is the confuser, right? The mirror, the disco ball. It's always trying to kind of throw the eyes off from the truth. And again, we look at that and we say, wow, I feel victimized, that I feel terrible, what an awful thing. But again, remember first that this is the common design springing out of oneness. So if we're getting mad at evil, we should really only be mad at our communal selves, because this is the birth of our own creation. And we should remember that life and experience is not possible without evil, because again, it's only the guarding of this truth, or the guarding of the truth and the gradual realization of the truth, that allows the physical universe to sustain, because otherwise it all warps back up or gets wrapped up back into oneness. So we've got the eyes of God trying to understand or trying to essentially get a full view of elseness. We then have God individuating into the eyes of its individual spirits for that purpose. We then have the spirit individuating into the perspectives of the physical beings. And what I think of those each as is kind of like the facets of the jewel. And so if elseness is kind of in the center of it, kind of like a fly in the amber, it's each individual perspective, be it the spirit perspective or the physical being perspective, is like a facet on that jewel. And essentially the course of the universe would be God learning how to see elseness from every possible angle. In other words, through every facet, right, from every angle in that facet. And that the reason we have so much individuation on the spirit level and then on the being level is to give God every possible angle to essentially, it's not really a riddle, but essentially to realize or to recognize what this is. which is again a simultaneous recognition that it is elseness, right? That it is confusion, that it is God, right? That God and it together are one, and that even this anti-God, this evil, which has been blocking God's realization of the truth, that too is God, right? That too is essentially a species of elseness, and that together they are oneness, and that in their harmonization they return to the state of pure potential from which they sprang. So in other words, the universe in this idea is essentially a concept of self-discovery in which God in a multi-step process realizes, oh my God, everything is God. God is everything, and all of that together is one. And all of these individual perspectives are different ways, different angles at looking at that same essential, not problem, but situation. And it's only after it's looked at from all the necessary perspectives that the distortion of evil is overcome. Because, you know, if we're only looking from here, evil will just set up a wall, right? And we never get through. But if we can have all these different perspectives, then even if evil has its wall on each individual perspective, if we gradually realize the truth, right, and I think this is what Buddhism essentially tries to teach us, is to recognize the operation of evil, recognize the operation of confusion in the mind, then we can get clearer seeing and begin to look through our individual facet into that elseness, which is in the core of us, right, and have that perspective, that broader perspective, which then allows a remanifestation or an out-manifestation back into oneness. Okay. So I'm going to draw these little blue squiggles in all of these, because essentially the way it works, I think of it as kind of being like fractal. The same core elseness that birthed the universe out of oneness, right, which then formed the original duality of God and anti-God, is essentially embedded in each individual spirit. But again, each individual spirit, it gets the same core elseness, but it gets just a different angle on it than the other, right? So it's the same thing, but viewed at from a different perspective, right? And then likewise, each individual being manifesting off of a spirit takes whatever angle that spirit has and then looks at it from all the possible angles there. So in other words, we're trying to get kind of a 360 view of elseness, and it requires all this individuation to happen. The same elseness is in each individual being, right, and is in each individual spirit. It's the same elseness that's in God, right, and the same elseness that's in anti-God, that anti-God is trying to block from God's view. Okay, so now if we want to start picturing the human body, here's how I would draw it. I would represent the spirit as essentially this tangle of elseness. Right? And again, what's unique about that spirit compared to all other spirits is it's seeing that same elseness from its particular angle, right? From its particular vantage point, right? And a different spirit may be looking at it from, above and right. This one's looking at it from below and left, right? All arrayed around it in essentially kind of a 360 panorama. There's this notion of anenkantavada. Just a brief tangent, you have letting the garbage truck go again. So anenkantavada, you have a dark room, there's a creature inside. One by one, individuals walk in, and all they can do is touch, right, one part of the creature. And then they have to come back out and put their ideas together to try to say what it is, right? So I think Rumi's got a beautiful poem about this. So one goes in and they feel a foot, and they feel it's a large foot, kind of a round, flat bottom with a hard surface. Another feels a very long, kind of cylindrical nose with ridges on it. One feels a big, flapping ear, right? Another feels a long, kind of hard, almost stone tube that comes to a point, right? And of course, the animal that's in there is an elephant. And if, they went in and turned the lights on, in other words, if there was an anti-God, they would immediately realize, oh, it's an elephant, riddle over, end of things. But it's the fact that they do it one at a time, they do it in the dark, and that each individual is only able to feel a certain part, and that they then have to essentially collaborate their image together, right? Kind of see if they can get it to coalesce to essentially reconstruct what the whole animal is, and then based on that reconstruction, come to the conclusion, oh, I get it. That thing that we all felt, we were all feeling parts of an elephant. It's kind of like that, right? That's the notion here. And so the individual spirit has its elseness, right? This tangle. And from its individual perspective, it's seeing elseness as a particular formation. And so what it does, and I'll use the I for spirit, is when it manifests its individual body, right? I'll use the human body as an example here. My drawings are even rougher than usual today. Is essentially what it does is it maps this into the human body through trauma. So, and the way that happens, and this part, I think my primate mind still struggles to believe, but I do believe it's true, is the way it does it is it doesn't imprint it like a fingerprint into the being at birth. Instead, what the spirit does, the spirit is creating the physical world, the environment, right? It's creating the trees, creating the sky, creating the body, right? So all of this is essentially a projection of the spirit. You might say it's almost a self-portrait, the spirit making its own self-portrait. And what it does is in the body through which the spirit experiences the world, right? The spirit has its individuated perspective. The spirit is always looking out from its individual body, right? So if the spirit is manifested here, it does not experience the insideness of the tree the way it experiences the insideness of this body. And what it'll do is it'll redraw this pattern in the body of the being. But the way it does it is it has circumstances in life introduce traumas. And those traumas act kind of like scars or scar tissue, right? And then stitch by stitch, this pattern, the original pattern, is recreated in the individual, right? And this may be what we call like the pain body or the trauma profile of the individual. And again, this is just a wild thought, so I'm going to linger here for a little bit. So the idea is the spirit is going to map this into the being. So what it's going to do, perhaps while the being is still in utero, it may introduce a trauma into the being's life. Maybe the mother gets sick. Maybe the mother has dietary issues, right? And that being, that frightened, fragile fetus, right, feels fear, experiences fear, and that may etch this part of the line in, right? And then early in its life, right, it may experience another serious illness. It may be physically or verbally abused. It may be neglected, right? Boom, we're getting another one. Bad breakup in early teenage years. You name it. Going to war, having the crisis of war. The wild concept here, right? And again, I say wild because my kind of conditioned intuition says this is absolute nonsense. But I truly believe this to be true, and I think if we look at the wisdom teachings of others, we see that this bears out, is essentially that the spirit is creating this experience so that it can then literally feel this pattern inside of itself, to rediscover and to essentially map it more intimately. And so we create this trauma pattern in our life. And, brief tangent, I think we may notice that we oftentimes recreate situations in our lives. We may always seek a partner who's of the same type. We may always go job after job of the same type. We may keep even reintroducing ourselves to similar physical environments, to similar drama, similar trauma. And kind of my theory on that is that's the spirit either trying to get that line into its being or trying to draw the being's attention to a particular curve so that the spirit can experience it more intimately. Because the idea here is that while the spirit is here, the spirit can perhaps have kind of an abstracted notion of it, can maybe experience this as a visual phenomena or a kind of sculpture. But until the spirit gets into a physical body and feels this trauma in its guts, right, in its heart, in its throat, in its head, until it can feel what it's like to have this pulsing and aching and stabbing within itself, it can't really know on the deepest and most intimate level what this shape is all about. And so the upshot of what I'm saying is that when we are having experiences in our lives of inner suffering, right? And I'm not talking here about like, a brick falls on your head and you have localized pain up here. Now that may introduce something down here, but this pain is not what I'm talking about. The pain I'm talking about is what gets stored in the body, gets mapped onto the body, excuse me, so that the next time, say we see, this was a brick that fell on our head, the next time we see a brick on the ground, we may go, oh no, and this thing gets activated, right? This thing hurts because we stored the pain of that experience in the body. This then triggers a memory of it, and now this is vibrating and we experience it as a pain. So I'm going to put a lowercase I above this one, because this is the perspective of the individual being that is manifesting in physical form and has this map of elseness, right? It's kind of private map of elseness, its little inset, literally kind of etched into its body. Now, the reason this is so confusing is, again, we've always got to remember the operation of evil. And, I hope in my presentation of this, I've destigmatized it. Evil isn't bad, right? Evil isn't wrong. Evil is a necessary function and feature of the physical universe as it exists. And of course, it's frustrating from the individual perspective of someone who's trying to realize the truth and to not suffer, to constantly feel met by Mara, evil, deception, confusion, the misattribution of suffering's cause, all these things that seem to extend our suffering, plunge us back into suffering. And so from the individual perspective, of course, it's understandable why the encounter with evil would be frustrating, why we may even see evil as an enemy. But I think the more we can look at things situationally, and the more we can see that evil is essentially just doing its job, the job that we, as the original creators, gave it, which is to confuse us, right, keep us from the truth of elseness long enough for us to have a rich and full experience, then we can see it less as an enemy or an antagonist and more as maybe a partner in an unfolding, you can call it drama, unfolding story, really an unfolding process of self-discovery. Okay, so what happens though is evil, right, is here, and evil is surrounding this and essentially preventing us from being able to realize what this is, that this is that, right? And so the first thing evil does is evil draws a line here. And evil says, this does not exist. This is all a lie. This is all made up, right? And I don't mean just like my kind of personal conception of things. I just mean any sense of divinity, any sense of spirituality, any sense of deep interconnectedness, any sense that we're all tentacles off the same octopus. Evil's like, that's kumbaya, pie in the sky nonsense. And I'm here extolling these ideas. I'm here making videos, and I've got websites that are basically all about this. But 4 years ago, I would agree with evil on this. I did agree with evil on this. And for years of my life, I did, because that's just where I was at. That's where I was at in my process. Now I look at it and I say, okay, what I think is happening, the reason I fall back into this narrow self-conception is evil is operating, confusion is operating, and is essentially just saying, this is nonsense, so focus here, right? Focus here, don't look back, don't look up, you're wasting your time, you're lying to yourself, you're kidding yourself, all those things. Or keeps us in such ignorance or such denial of it that we don't even feel tempted to go into that concept. And anytime someone speaks about it, we roll our eyes or just say, well, that's them doing that. And so what evil does is it says, okay, no, the reason you're hurting is your environment hurts you, right? That brick is your environment. That wasn't your spirit, which is God, which is oneness, which is really you, right? And everything, right? No, that was your environment, or that was your parent abusing you, right? Or that enemy soldier who shot you, right? That was that dog that bit you. It was that disease that harmed you, right? It was that loved one who mistreated you, right? And so what we do is we blame, right? Now what's interesting about this is evil presents the confusion, right? What did I represent with the disco ball, right? We get this inclination to look back here, but evil puts the disco ball up, right, and points our direction back here. But we are the ones who then have the freedom either to blame or not. and this is one choice point we can start to introduce as we go further, is we could say, look, even though I'm feeling pain, and even though I'm feeling tempted to blame it on the other person, blame it on my environment, blame it on the world, I'm instead going to just not do that. And I'm going to see if I can take more ownership over the situation, see if I can recognize the situation as something good, something that's for my benefit. And so if instead we restore the possibility that we are creating this life for ourselves, as an individual being, and that one of the reasons we're here is to intimately experience both the events in life that introduce this suffering into our life, introduce this trauma into our being, and then, you may call that kind of the first half of life, is kind of sketching this onto our body. And then the second half is actually directing our attention, instead of constantly fixating on the environment, getting afraid of it, seeing it as the enemy, seeing it as a threat, we instead direct our attention inward. And we say, okay, I want to see if I can help this heal. I'm going to treat this as my legacy, as my opportunity. And I'm going to see my life, again, among many other things, as an opportunity to better understand and to better heal this. And so part of the issue, though, the reason this is difficult, again, there's evil is pervasive, is this map is not the way we experience things, at least not typically, at least not based on what I've seen or what I personally experienced in most of my life. Is I don't have this sense of, okay, I've got this kind of tangled knot of pain inside myself, it's been kind of stitched on there by different traumas I experienced in my life, and now I get the opportunity to deal with it. Usually, at least what I experienced, was I was just like, sometimes I wasn't even aware that I was in pain, so it was all up here. And again, I was just blaming myself, blaming others, blaming the past, fearing the future. Or if I did have the wherewithal to feel a pain, I blamed the pain, I was like, this pain in my chest, this pain in my ribs, this pain in my throat, it's holding me back, it's burdening me. And again, this is all the product of the confusion, created by the disco ball. It's no accident. It's not a flaw or a fault in us. The gradual discovery and realization of the truth is all part of the unfolding perfection of time. But we can see kind of steps in a process toward a more gradual realization of what I think, at least, is the truer representation of the situation. And when we're stuck here, feeling headaches, feeling body aches, feeling a knot in our stomach, but not conceiving it as part of a larger whole, but just seeing it as an individual flash, something that came across my awareness, feels unfortunate, feels like abuse, feels like torture, can feel like all kinds of things. That can then lead into all kinds of negative stories, all kinds of blame games, all kinds of speculation and confusion. Again, all dances under the disco ball of evil, designed to keep us from realizing, or at least slowing our process of realizing what is. Now, I think the reason we individuate into a lot of different lifetimes, and the reason that incarnation is real, is because evil prevents us in our first life, maybe our first 100 life, who knows, maybe our first thousands life, millions of lives, from fully realizing the situation we're in. And it's only gradually, after iteration after iteration after iteration, after again and again and again falling prey to the illusions of evil, to the illusions of the disco ball, the victim mentality, the villain mentality, the hero mentality, the dance of drama, that we start to realize that that's not getting us anywhere, that it doesn't bear any fruit, that all we end up doing is essentially getting into one squabble after another, either internally or externally. We then build systems of avoidance, of deterrence around, Don't let people talk to me that way. Shut it down if it's going that way. I'm just going to leave if it's going that way. And again, these may all be wise individual decisions for risk or danger management in individual crisis moment. But if that is our habit, if that becomes our lifestyle, our way of being, then essentially what we're doing is we're doing the dance of confusion, losing ourselves to all these individual flashes and not beginning to put together the whole picture that, oh man, maybe this pattern of pain inside myself, the fact that these same things keep triggering me, is an invitation for introspection, an invitation to actually begin to attend to it and to heal it, to invite healing to happen. And so if we can begin working backwards in that way, right? If we begin to say, okay, I'm not going to see the pain inside of me and my triggering patterns, right? The patterns of me having kind of PTSD, of getting suddenly annoyed or frustrated or hot under the collar about the same things over and over. If instead I'm going to see that as an opportunity to learn, we could begin, I think, to work backwards toward a clearer perspective. What we're doing is trying to engage in this space here. And what I think happens is if we get to this space, this is where real healing can begin. Because at this point, what we can begin to do is to attend and surrender, right? And so attending is what the being does, right? We may meditate. And in our state of meditation, we can feel, right, from within the features of this pain, where the pain is in our body, how it feels, right? Our awareness may bring to mind for us, okay, these certain things tend to activate it. If I think about this person, right, this ex or this bad experience I had, I tend to feel it here. If I think about this childhood trauma I have, wow, it tends to flare up here or here. We could begin to realize what this thing really is, which is a map of our past experience in our environment, which was put there by our spirit to give us the opportunity, right, or the invitation to experience it intimately on the level of feeling. And if what we can essentially do is to stop thinking about it, right, stops thinking, okay, I've got to get rid of it, I've got to fix it, right? Or stop thinking about how did it get there, why is it there, right? We can see the connection between where it came from, but it's not like we want to relitigate the past, right, or relive those past experiences. What we're really trying to do is to get into a contemplative state where the mind is really as open as we can have it, as calm as we can have it, thoughts are coming and going through, and what we're really doing is we're attending on the level of feeling to this. We are feeling our pain intimately. And this, again, is a difficult thing because when we think about that, we may think, okay, feel into the pain, right? Almost reach out and grab it. But that's a gripping or a clasping that really proves counterproductive because, again, what we're trying to do there is we're trying to speed up the process, trying to seize control of the process, and that really feeds more back into the negativity and the victim and the scarcity mindset. What we really want to do is have an open, spacious mind and attend on the level of feeling, but just have those feelings come and go through our awareness. So in other words, we don't numb ourselves with the pain, with chemicals, or with escaping into thought, or with playing blame games and drama games. We sit there with our bodies and we allow those feelings to arise, to last, and to pass away. And we are not sitting there trying to sketch out the map of the patterns of the pain within us. We are essentially allowing our intuition over time of feeling it again and again and again to essentially construct that map for us. Kind of like that Anankantavada I talked about with the elephant. We allow our intuition, like one person going into that dark room at a time, to feel this part, right? To feel this part, to feel this part. We're not controlling it. The intuition takes care of that itself. What we have to do is essentially create the calmness, the space, the isolation from environment, and the avoidance of getting caught up in our thinking to give ourselves the awareness and the attention directed toward the body, right, that allows this to happen. And that was one of the Buddhist teachings. The path to the end of the defilements, the path to the end of aversion, infatuation, and ignorance is present moment awareness directed toward the body. That's what he said, present moment awareness directed toward the body. And I think that is kind of what's going on here in this model, is that when we meditate or when we're contemplative, essentially part of what we're doing is we're allowing our intuition to feel our pain. And what that then does, right, all information is shared across this entire field, is available to on the higher levels to the lower, but not always available on the lower levels to the higher, right? So it's not like I can say, hey God, what are the lottery numbers for this week and expect to get it? But God can know every single bit of my thoughts, everything I look out of my side eye, every scrap or fragment of every dream I've had, because the information flows freely and totally in this direction. So what the spirit can then do is essentially the spirit can enrich this map with the data from the feeling that happens at the physical level. In other words, this goes from being just an abstract visual construction or a map into being a fully felt and fully realized experience. And when the spirit is able to fully feel the entirety of this pattern, right, then it's getting information which is useful and valuable to God. Because again, the higher we go up, we get higher into levels of abstraction. And essentially it's kind of a continuum of intimacy and perspective, right? From here we have a perspective that can see the entirety of things all at once, but it doesn't have the intimacy to be able to feel with the same level of particularity that you can here. So that's why part of the reason we have the individuation is so that this individual being attending to its individual life and its individual pattern of pain inside of itself can gather a richness of data over time, right? Perhaps over many, many lifetimes, feeding that up the chain, which allows the spirit to more fully understand the nature of elseness, which allows God to more fully understand the nature of elseness, eventually leading to the realization, which I think is what enlightenment is, which is that all of this is oneness. All of this is one. And even though it's manifesting in all these myriad forms think about the Amazon. Think about the variety of life teeming in that space. That all of that diversity, right, all of that richness could extend from a single spaceless and timeless source. That everything is essentially unified. That is, I think, the core realization of oneness, of enlightenment. And that part of the way that happens is that this individual comes to such a state of peace with the fact of its suffering that essentially releases its antagonism toward it, releases its notion of elseness toward its own suffering. And in that moment of realization, in that moment of acceptance of suffering as an aspect of the individual, essentially both are freed from the drama game of this hating this and this feeling hated by this, right? So essentially liberate the suffering from its conceptualization as our enemy, right? And then we break that drama game down and essentially allow for a realization of, oh my Lord, I am you, you are me, and really beyond that, we are one. And then what's happening over the course of the universe in this theory is each individual who has that realization of enlightenment, right, comes to full peace with the fact of their suffering. And if you look at the Buddha's Noble Truths, right, the first two are literally about suffering. And then the second two are about the process to end suffering. It's not about fighting suffering in the environment, right? The Buddha isn't saying, take up your sword for this social cause or that environmental cause or that. He's saying if you really want to get into the core of things, right, it's really more about making peace with the fact of the suffering within you and beginning to understand the patterns. And for Buddha, it's wanting. I really think on a deep level, it's really about wanting this suffering to go away. That's the wanting we really need to make peace with. And that the more and more we can have peace with the fact that our suffering is not some terrible accident, right? Not some awful thing that's happened to us, but actually a gift given to us to have the ability to experience, and also our ticket home. Because as we engage with this suffering more deeply and we allow this suffering to heal, we allow the suffering to be realized for what it is, that's how we actually begin the process backwards, up to spirit, back to God, and back into oneness. And so as each individual being has its own experience toward Buddhahood, that's how you get that jewel. Right? If you could think of evil maybe being like a cloud or a fog on the jewel that prevents, on each aspect or each facet of the jewel, that prevents us from seeing that core of oneness clearly. If the individual can make peace with the fact of the suffering in it, and make peace with the fact that evil is dancing around that suffering all the time, confusing, pointing in all different directions, anywhere but here, or if you get here to say, okay, well, this is your fault, or this is their fault, right? If instead we can recognize evil for what it is, right? That kind of demystifies it. And then recognize elseness for what it is, which is perfection, which is God, which is part of the universal state. This is how essentially you get clarity through this aspect. And now elseness, from God's perspective, is understood clearly more than it was before, because through this aspect, right, created by this individual being, from the spirit to the being, having a realization of the nature of evil and the nature of suffering, now God is able to more fully see elseness, and the light of God's loving awareness is able to slowly untangle the knot and soften it so that this coil, this curl, can reform the ring that it is. And so the death of the universe, if we want to call it that, really more the return out of individuation and manifestation back into our core state of oneness, is the gradual making peace with evil and its confusing nature, which really comes from recognizing it for what it is, stopping fighting it and just learning its patterns and learning to realize and recognize when it's operating. And then attending to the suffering that it's blocking our attention from, and feeling on an intimate level, allowing it to be there, right? Not treating it as something that we need to get rid of or attack or change. This is what it gradually allows God to turn that jewel. And once God can see the entirety of elseness, right, through every facet of that jewel, that's when all can be reharmonized into oneness, because God has that ultimate realization. I see now. Evil is not other, right? And elseness is not other. Elseness is not else, right? Elseness is one. Elseness is God. Right? Evil is one. Evil is God. But it's not just enough to know that on an abstract or individual level. It needs to be experienced and realized in the individual being, in the individual body, right? This is the design that we've created. And so instead of begrudging that process, instead of seeing it as a curse, seeing it as the human condition, like that's some kind of stain or mark on us, we can instead see it as part of a deep divine legacy, and that the operation of suffering within us and the operation of evil within us is all really just the unfolding of one, and is all one.